All right, so the third section of this chapter, we are going to talk about, come on, there we go, urine storage and elimination. So we talked about the functions of the nephron and the kidney and some of the important structures in the kidney. Now we're going to talk about the kind of transport and storage structures in the urinary system. So the urinary tract basically transports, stores, and eliminates urine. So the ureters are the long tubes that connect the kidney to the bladder. And the urinary bladder is a hollow muscular organ where urine can be stored. Up to a liter of urine can be stored before it gets excreted. And the urethra is another hollow tube that basically excretes urine from the body. So the urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder, and here's male and female anatomy. So right here is the urinary bladder in males, over here in females. So this is the urethra here in females from the neck of the bladder all the way to the exterior portion of the body. In males, it's much longer. So here's the urinary bladder, and the urethra runs all the way through this gland called the prostate gland, and then into the penis, and then runs all the way through there until it hits the external portions of the body. So the male urethra is much longer, but it also transports semen as well as urine. Which we'll talk about in the next chapter. The process of urination is called micturition. And basically the wall of the urinary bladder is made up of the mucosa, its innermost layer, submucosa, then the muscularis layers in the external portion, and the more superficial layers. The muscularis layer is also called the detrusor muscle, and it has an inner layer and outer layer of longitudinal muscle and circular muscles. And basically the contraction of this muscle is what compresses the bladder and expels urine into the urethra. So on either in two areas of the urethra, there are sphincters. They are involuntary smooth muscle in one, found at the neck of the urinary bladder. Where the urinary bladder meets the urethra is the internal urethral sphincter. And the external urethral sphincter is located where the urethra passes through what's called the urogenital diaphragm. And that's a voluntary skeletal muscle. So when you have to use the restroom and you're holding it that you have voluntary control over is skeletal muscle. It's the external urethral sphincter. So take a look here. Here's a bladder. Right here's the neck of the bladder where it meets the urethra. So the internal urethral sphincter would be here and here as kind of the circular muscle that surrounds that opening. The external urethral sphincter would be here. There's more smooth muscle that surrounds the urethra itself, and basically just pinches off the urethra. This muscle here is the detrusor muscle, that big muscle that contracts and expels urine from the bladder. And the reflex, basically what causes urination or micturition to occur, is an increase in volume of urine in the bladder that stretches the walls of the bladder and stretches receptors. There's stretch receptors here that respond to changes in membrane distortion. And basically those stretch receptors are sensory neurons or sensory receptors that send information to the sacral portion of the spinal cord. And parasympathetic motor fibers then carry motor commands back to the urinary bladder to stimulate the detrusor muscle to contract. So this is all involuntary by way of the parasympathetic nervous system. And basically voluntary relaxation of the external urethral sphincter then causes relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter, and that allows for urination. So a couple things have to happen. Stretch has to occur as urine fills the bladder. That stretch sends sensory information to the spinal cord. The spinal cord then sends motor information by parasympathetic neurons back to the detrusor muscle to tell it to contract, and that's what starts to push urine out of the bladder. When you voluntarily relax the external urethral sphincter, that signals to the internal urethral sphincter to relax as well, and allows the urine being expelled from the bladder to move through the urethra externally. So this is the figure that summarizes all of that. It's a really important figure. In urine, we can examine clinically a urine sample, and we can do a chemical analysis, and these screening tests basically detect changes in pH. Glucose, I've mentioned before, glucose is in the urine is an indication that maybe prediabetes or diabetes is occurring. Ketone bodies is another example, and other plasma proteins. Proteins aren't typically supposed to be located in the urine. They're really large molecules that shouldn't make their way into the urine. They should stay in the blood. So if they're in the urine, there's something wrong. Same thing with hemoglobin. That means red blood cells have been broken down, and that could be an indication of a problem. But also in urinalysis, we can detect hormones like human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, is a pregnancy hormone. And when you take a pregnancy test and you pee on a stick, that's what we're trying to measure. And that's an indication that pregnancy has occurred. This would be a urinalysis strip. You just dip this strip into a sample of urine and then look for color changes here on the side of this tube to indicate the presence of or lack thereof certain chemicals or certain substances. Okay, so that was a really short video about urinalysis, but there are 2 more to go, so I will see you in the next section.